Hello, welcome to your very last section of Chapter 2. So this is the very last information that we'll test over on Thursday. Okay, so this is all about the changes that matter. And we have already kind of talked about chemical changes and chemical properties. So a lot of this may seem like a review, but I really just want to make sure we dedicate just time onto this because it can be really easy to confuse a chemical reaction, or excuse me, a chemical change with a physical change. So I want to make sure that we can distinguish between the two. A couple of things that I want you to keep in mind is not only the idea of chemical changes, but keep in mind what a physical change is so you can better be able to decipher between the two. So the things that you should be able to do when we are done with this video, you should be able to identify the chemical properties of a substance. You should be able to describe chemical changes and differentiate them from physical changes. And then you should be able to use various visual clues. Oh my gosh, I spelled that wrong. That's so embarrassing. But oh well. Okay, so use visual clues to identify whether a chemical reaction is taking place. I am going to give you some big signs on your test. I'll give you some pretty obvious hints as to whether or not it's a chemical or a physical change. Um, if you don't know it really just means that you didn't take the time to study because I'm giving you some pretty big clues. So here we go. The first thing we need to do is define a chemical change. So a chemical change, before we can do that, we need to talk about chemical properties. So chemical properties describe the ability of a substance to undergo a specific chemical change. So chemical properties are the describing factor. Remember, we talked about that. Properties are describing, changes are the actions that actually occur. So some good examples of properties would be like corrosion or the ability to break down would be the action. So the breaking down is the action. Chemical reaction or reactivity is a property, a chemical property. The ability to react, or for water to react with sulfur. That is a specific action done when you mix sulfur and water. So chemical properties and changes are a lot more specific because you can say reactivity and everything has the ability to react, but you can't just put two things together and say, okay, react. No, there's a lot more that goes into it, and we're actually going to talk about that too towards the end of this video. But I do want you to make sure you know that a chemical property describes the ability of a substance to undergo a specific chemical change. Chemical properties can only be observed as the substance is in the process of being changed into a different substance. So what that means is that generally you have to observe what's actually going on to the material in order for you to know if a chemical property is being observed or not. So I've always talked about this example and I really like this example. It's one that we've all seen. So when exposed to air, an object made of iron will eventually begin to rust. And we've all seen this. So as rust forms on the surface of an iron, it flakes off to expose more iron. And this will continue to rust and continue to rust. So rust is a chemical property, right? It's that breakdown. And so rust, the ability to rust is the chemical property. Rusting or something being rusted is the chemical change. And so I know that sounds really confusing, but it's very specific to the specific property. And so what's going on a chemical level is that the iron is capable of combining with oxygen to form an iron oxide. And then the chemical name rust is what we've given it, but it's just that breakdown of that iron due to the interactions of oxygen and water at times. So this is a corrosion process. And so anytime you see the words burn, rot, explode, decompose, ferment, these are all words to describe chemical changes. So these are all chemical properties. Okay, so burn, rot, explode, decompose, and ferment. These are all properties that have the ability to change an item from one thing to another. So fermented fruit is no longer fruit you want to eat. Okay, it may taste a little bit different and may make you not feel good or feel good depending on who you are. But it is a completely new substance with new chemical properties not chemical properties, but physical properties. I am really just blowing it today. So again, a chemical property is the describer. The chemical change that it undergoes completely changes one substance from one thing to another. A nice way of describing chemical properties is saying chemical reactions, right? Because when you do a chemical reaction, you're completely changing from one thing to another. And so now we are going to focus on the idea not just of chemical changes and properties, but of chemical reactions. So you need to know what a chemical reaction is. A chemical reaction is a process that occurs when one or more substances are changed into one or more new substances. So you're going from one thing to another. It's like me saying A plus B gives me AB. So I have a brand new substance from different things. So both interchangeable words, chemical change, also called a chemical reaction. That's something you should really know, and probably write down, underline, do whatever you can, but chemical change is also called a chemical reaction. Okay? One example I'm going to talk about really quickly before we move on is the idea of taking zinc, which is like a silver gray color, and it can be ground into a powder, a really nice fine powder. So if zinc is mixed at room temperature with powdered sulfur, and sulfur is a bright yellow element. These are both very distinguishable elements. They're very obvious on what you're looking at. The result is a mixture of zinc and sulfur. So if you're mixing zinc, which is silver and gray, and you're mixing sulfur, which is yellow. So if you mix the two and if you just put them together, the zinc and the sulfur, nothing is going to happen. So there's no chemical reaction that happens. You can't just put them together. Now, some things you can bring together and there's a reaction, but when you have this zinc and you have this sulfur and you just say, okay, you need to react, nothing is going to happen. In order for a chemical reaction to occur, you need to see, there are certain clues, and we're going to talk about those clues in the next slide. But there must be energy present in order for a chemical reaction to occur. So you need to provide some form of heat. Heat is our big player when it comes to chemical reactions. So anytime we have heat playing in here, some kind of reaction will occur. So if energy is provided to the mixture in the form of heat, so if I have my zinc and my sulfur and I provide heat to them, then now I have what's known as zinc sulfide, which is a combination of zinc and sulfur. It is now a brand new substance. It even has a brand new color. So you take silver, you take yellow, and boom, you get a white powdery substance. It makes absolutely no sense, but when you add heat to it, it makes perfect sense. In the next slide, I'm going to show you what those two things on each side are called and how you indicate in a chemical equation what these look like. Okay, so last slide we talked about chemical changes, and remember a nice name for chemical change is chemical reaction. And so chemical reactions, they have reactants and they have products. A reactant is a substance that is present at the start of a chemical reaction. So I'm going to write down what this kind of looks like. So your reactants are always going to be on your left side. So let's say A plus B. Those are my reactants. In between those two things, you're going to have an arrow, and this arrow indicates that something is going on, that a change is occurring. The arrow tells you a change is occurring. After the change has occurred, you have what's known now as a product, or products in some cases. Couldn't fit my S in there. So A plus B gives me AB. Okay, A is an individual substance, B is an individual substance. After the change has occurred, we now have AB, which is now a new individual substance. So product is a substance that is present at the end of a chemical reaction. All of these things have their own properties individual to them. You've combined them chemically, and now you have a brand new substance with its own individual properties. Nice ways to recognize that chemical reactions have occurred. So these are some clues. I will tell you that some of these things are going to sound like physical properties, and so I want you to be able to decipher between the two. The first clue is a change of color occurs during the reaction. So when you're doing a reaction, if you've mixed sulfur and zinc together and you've presented heat in it, you now will probably see a color change at the end. Okay, so the color, to change color, we know is a physical property, but in a chemical reaction, if that has occurred, that is a good indication to tell you that a chemical reaction has occurred, right? We started with silver and yellow and we got white. So it's kind of weird that it happened, but that is a good clue to tell you, yep, a chemical reaction has occurred. A gas is produced during the reaction. Anytime you've watched probably any movie that is trying to replicate science, you'll see a whole bunch of gas form. That is a great sign that something is occurring. A solid product called a precipitate is produced in the reaction. And so we'll do this in lab where you'll produce a precipitate. But those are nice ways. Those are like the byproducts of the reaction. And that tells you, okay, something is going on because it's forming something else as well. And then finally, visible transfer of energy occurs. So if you have like light or sound within that reaction, then you know a reaction has occurred. All of these things are very, very much great signs to tell you chemical changes or chemical reactions are occurring. That is all I have for this video. So it's a pretty short video. We have been kind of talking about this in the mix of talking about physical reactions. We've reviewed this and done all of this. If you have any questions, though, please ask me at the end of this video. If you just don't understand, please come see me because your test is in a couple days and I don't want you freaking out. See ya.